Well, thank you for having me, Anthony. This is a pleasure to do this. I see Melody here, and I'm gonna probably pronounce it wrong. Meruyet from Kazakhstan and Roshana. If you could tell me if it's okay if people introduce themselves, and tell me why you decided to attend this presentation, and if you can tell me your connection to North Park. I'd love to hear from you. Melody, did you want to go first?
Sure. I currently live in Mason City, Iowa, but I'm a native Chicagoan. I'm a nursing graduate from 1972, so I'm one of the pioneer nursing nurses in the BSN program. I'm interested. My daughter has served in mission work in Alaska, working with Indigenous people up there. And I have been on a medical ambassador team with the Paul Carlson Partnership helping to write diabetes education material for our Congolese hospitals and clinics.
Yeah, and you'll see in my presentation, a lot of the research comes out of Canada, so with Indigenous groups. So good. It's good to have you here. And thank you for staying connected with North Park. Roshana or Maruyet, did you want to say something about yourselves while you're here today?
Yeah, I have completed my master's degree in counseling psychology in 2021, and I have been always curious about different cultures, and for me, it's a chance to learn about ancient indigenous wisdom because I believe all our ancestors, they're interconnected, and there is some mutual deep wisdom, which is we're kind of like a detached because of all of this technology growth and development, and we're kind of like a detached. So for me, it's kind of like interesting how to go back in a kind of like a harmony way and awaken that ancient and like ancient wisdom of our cultures.
Yeah, that's great. And that's part of the reason why I did this project, exactly the way you explained it, Mary. Yet, so good. I'm glad that you're here. And thank you for joining. I know you said it's 11 p.m. In Kazakhstan, so
Thank you.
you're being a trooper. Roshana,
Oh,
how
thank you
about
for
you?
having me.
Yeah, anytime.
Hey everybody. I'd love to echo what Mariette just shared. I attended North Park between 2004 and 2008, and back in the day I was an English and philosophy major. In the years since my time at North Park, I've become a public historian, and so a recent project of mine delves into the legacy of slavery out in Massachusetts. The foundation of Harvard Law School, my team, we worked with a few dozen of the living descendants of people enslaved at the site. And we've also learned a lot about indigeneity and different cultural traditions surrounding wisdom and how those cultural traditions predate cultural catastrophe. And it's been so life affirming and so wonderful to be like a humble student and steward of all of these robust culture, bodies of cultural knowledge. And I'm just here to learn and to be in community. So it's nice to see y'all.
Great to have you, Roshana. So let me just talk a little bit about the genesis of this project, how it came about, and what led me to work with Ahab Abdu. Ahab Abdu is associate professor of comparative international education at Wilfrid Laurier University outside of Toronto. So about 6, 7 years ago, I was invited to teach for a semester at the American University in Cairo in their education department. And I flew out to Egypt. I was teaching 2 classes with students, and I was just engaging with the locals and with my students. And I found it interesting how they weren't very much connected to their ancient Egyptian past. And I was thinking like, wow, they have such a glorious ancient past and they don't sort of embrace it, right? So Ahab, who happened to be Egyptian, and who had been a student, undergraduate student at American University in Cairo, we sort of connected and raised this issue to him. And I said, well, what's going on here? I mean, why is it that they're not really embracing it? He said, well, the Coptic Christians are more in tune with it than Muslim Egyptians with their ancient Egyptian past. And for me, who grew up in a family that's Greek American, and I still have ties to Greece, embracing ancient Greece because it wasn't Christian, right? It's not something that's really discussed. We see them as our ancestors, regardless of what their religious faith was before the advent of Christianity in Europe, right? So we began to explore that topic, and we wanted to know more of which communities around the world embrace their ancient indigenous traditions, um, Judeo-Christian Islamic, we'll say, traditions, right? Which cultures say to themselves, yeah, well, maybe these people weren't Muslim like us, or Jewish like us, or Christian like us, but what is it that we can learn from them, right? What is it maybe that still exists within our Christian, Muslim, or Jewish tradition that's still there, right? That's still being practiced. So this was ultimately the genesis of the project. When we send out fillers out there to see who wanted to engage in the project to contribute chapters to our books, we found that an overwhelming number of scholars were coming from Canada, partly because that's where Ahab is a resident and a scholar at right now. But also there are a lot of chapters from generally the Americas, about ancient indigenous traditions in the Americas, Native American groups primarily, right? And then we saw chapters coming in from Europe, from Africa, and from Asia, and so forth. So there was a lot of people that wanted to contribute to this. That we had to do a two-volume book, essentially, for this. And then this project has sort of blown up in a way that we're looking to maybe even start an institute. We're working on a special section in a journal with more chapter contributors uh, to the project. And we're seeing that a host of people are contacting us wanting to learn more about this. So it's something that's, you know, a lot of groups have become interested to learn more about what is it that we can learn from our ancient indigenous ancestors. And when I say ancient indigenous ancestors, we all come from some sort of ancient indigenous sort of tradition. So let's look at a little bit about the edited volume. So what I want to do essentially today, and at the end, I want to take your questions. I want to hear more from you as well, but I'll give an overview of the two volumes that we published last year. But for purposes of this presentation, I'll cover the Americas, the edited volume on the Americas, which is volume one. And then I'll take questions at the end. Ancient indigenous wisdom traditions towards more balanced curricular representations and classroom practices explores the integration of African, North American, Caribbean, and Euro-Asian wisdom traditions within modern education for the purposes of fostering a more inclusive understanding of ancient history. So really what we were looking at primarily was how certain nations, how certain groups treat their ancient ancestors and their traditions within their textbooks and curricula. These are the two volumes that were published. We received good reviews from other authors who wrote reviews for journals. 39 scholars from around the world contributed to these two volumes, and more than 10 nations are covered. And this is a map of the various countries that are covered. The editors of the volumes, which is me and Ahab, we argue that curricula often perpetuates exclusionary discourses that marginalize specific cultures and histories, often portraying indigenous and ancient non-Abrahamic beliefs with skepticism and antagonism. So when we talk about Abrahamic traditions, we're really talking about the three major religions, monotheistic religions in the world, which is Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. We also challenge conventional narratives within religious studies, noting how traditional interpretations of the Bible, Torah, and Quran have sometimes cast non-Abrahamic traditions as divergent and not worth understanding. Ultimately, we advocate for a holistic and balanced framework that validates diverse cultural and spiritual heritages, which invariably enrich students' perspectives about history, culture, and spirituality. But before I delve into each of the chapter, let's step away for a moment from all this theoretical stuff and focus a bit more on the more everyday stuff. And let's take a moment and think about if we've ever had an ancestor who wasn't part of the three Abrahamic religions in the world, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, or part of any major current religious tradition for that matter. Well, the truth is we all have ancestors, right? That didn't at one point practice Christianity, or didn't practice Judaism, or didn't practice Islam, or Judaism, or Buddhism, right? So, and if we go back to our ancient past, everybody has, right? So now let's ask ourselves, how long were these ancestors participating in their religions before they adopted another religion, right? So how long did they practice this religion before they adopted another religion? So in my case, right, I told you my family's from Greece. That's really where Christianity sort of starts in Europe, right? It begins to spread with Paul into the rest of Europe. And I could say maybe my ancestors were practicing it for just shy of 2,000 years, right? So they were a lot longer in the area, right? So what were those people practicing for 3,000 years before Christianity came in, right? Let's also ask ourselves, what have we lost, or what traces of these indigenous faiths can still be found in our modern day religions? So the other example I give is like, I come from my family come from a small town in Greece, about 450 people. And there's a main church in the center of the town, but then there's these chapels scattered all over around the town, out in the farm, what would be the like, sort of farmland, right, on the hills and so forth. Um, in one of those churches, you could walk in, and it's obvious that they've sort of built a church on top of this ancient sort of temple. And this was sort of a way maybe for them to sort of transition the population from practicing their ancient indigenous religion into practicing Christianity. In an earlier study that Ahab and I did on comparing Greece and Egypt, we found that among the key reasons that many ancient Egyptians converted to Christianity and why we find such prominence of the Virgin Mary in the Coptic Orthodox Church is due to the prominence of the goddess Isis and her large numbers of believers in Egypt and throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Both the ancient Egyptian deity Isis and the Virgin Mary were key mother figures who sought to protect their sons from those who wished to do them harm. Given that, quote, pagan worship was only outlawed in the 5th century Common Era, it could be argued that the switch in devotion from Isis to Mary was never consciously made, at least not one on the popular level. Similarly, in Greece, the Virgin Mary is often connected to the goddess Athena, Parthenos meaning the Virgin Mary, or Athena, the Virgin Goddess, right? And Athena in ancient Greece is also seen as a Virgin Goddess. 14 scholars contributed to this volume. The chapters focus on the First Nations peoples of Canada, the Indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, and the Native American people of the United States. Along with Ahab, we wrote the introduction and conclusions, while William F. Pinar wrote the foreword. And these are the contributors and their chapters. You can see Rafael V. Capo Garcia wrote on, he's from the University of Puerto Rico, and his chapter is on Puerto Rico. Chan, it's in Canada. Deer is Canada as well. But I'm going to go through some of these chapters with you. So let's start off with Blair Stonechild. Blair Stonechild is a First Nation scholar. His chapter, Revitalizing Indigenous Belief Systems Implications for Curriculum, sheds light on the colonial forces that have historically impacted curricular representation in Canada. His work highlights how these representations can marginalize Indigenous histories, beliefs, and contributions, offering insight into why curriculum reform is necessary to create more inclusive and accurate historical narratives. According to Stonechild, in the case of the First Nations people in Canada, Indigenous people were seen as morally and intellectually deficient. Hence, education was laced with copious amounts of discipline and Christian religious indoctrination to quote unquote civilize and assimilate Indigenous peoples. Stonechild, who attended one of the boarding schools, learned firsthand about the portrayal of his own people in school textbooks. He writes, before Europeans came to Canada, prehistoric, or rather, the textbooks write, before Europeans came to Canada, prehistoric man had worked out his own way of life in the American continent. The Indian was a Canadian prehistoric man. Though some Indian groups did plant crops and scratched a living from the soil, the primitive Canadian Indian lived largely on hunting and fishing. Frank Deere and Rebecca Herringer's chapter on witnesses the unflinching use of power that schools and teachers in Canada had when it came to the destruction of Native American culture and identity. It was a goal of the Canadian residential school movement to quote unquote save the Indigenous population by forcing them to assimilate into Anglo-Christian culture, stifling, punishing, and in many cases, and in the case of traditional hairstyles, literally cutting off anything that gave students a tangible connection to their ancestors, their native language and culture. The Indian residential schools in Canada were managed by government and religious authorities for much of the 19th and 20th centuries, and children were often removed from their homes without their parents' consent. Removing children from their communities and placing them in schools far from their homes invariably hindered future generations of Native children from learning their language, customs, and tradition, which further advanced the process of assimilation. Jackson Pinn's chapter examines how the ancient Indigenous mound buildings of southern Ontario, particularly the Serpent Mounds, has been represented in the province's history, curricula, and school textbooks. Approximately 2,000 years ago, the Adena Hopewell tradition, a network of Indigenous groups, spanned North America from Florida to the Great Lakes. The Serpent Mound site, the largest burial mound in North America, is linked to similar structures in the Ohio Valley in Florida, highlighting a deep history of trade and cultural exchange across the area. The Point Peninsula Complex in Ontario, known for its pottery carvings and burial mounds near water bodies, provides further evidence of this extensive pre-colonial network. European colonization drastically reduced the indigenous population, erasing many cultural traditions, including knowledge of the serpent mounds. Pinda also reflects on his personal connection to the site as a mixed indigenous and European with ties to the Atterville First Nation. Using an indigenous metissage methodology, his study presents diverse perspectives on the serpent mounds, challenging colonial notions and advocating for a broader understanding of Indigenous history. Wolfstone's chapter examines mother-centered cultures, or what she calls matricultures, and their representation in Canadian social studies curricula. Grounded in critical and feminist theories, she explores ancient and existing matricultures by analyzing how they appear in 912 textbooks, Given that education in Canada is provincially governed, but influenced by national inquiries such as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2015 and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's and Girls National Inquiry 2019, Wolfstone's chapter aims to address these calls to action by revealing the marginalization of Indigenous matricultures and by further recommending ways to restore their presence in education. Chan and Parker Shandell's chapter critically reflects on the ongoing challenges of reconciliation in Canadian education, particularly in Ontario, where Indigenous voices remain marginalized despite calls for systematic change. While our volume addresses reconciling ancient Indigenous belief systems and curricula, Chan and Parker Shandell's chapter focus solely on First Nation, Métis, and Inuit perspectives, recognize the complexity of this discussion. The authors, as non-Indigenous individuals, acknowledge their complicity to systematic racism and approach their research work as a means of unraveling their own understanding alongside other Canadians. The chapter situates its discussion within the broader national concept of reconciliation efforts in Canada, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 92 calls to action, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and Jordan's Principle. By recognizing the long-term nature of reconciliation, the authors pose a central question: how do provincial curricula shape what is taught about Indigenous rights and relationality, and should formal curricula take precedence over more localized, relationship-based, and informal education? To better understand this, the authors review Ontario's history, Indigenous community calls for change, and the province's curricular response. They conclude by considering how a civic religious literacy framework might offer insights into balancing curricular expectations with Indigenous perspectives, ultimately guiding reconciliation efforts in education in Canada. Tadashi Dozono's chapter examines California's curricular guidelines through critical discourse analysis, showing how even recent curricular frameworks can still subtly reinforce uh, colonial perspective. Tadashi analyzed the history social science framework of California public schools, kindergarten through grade 12, 2017. His analysis reveals how Indigenous histories and contributions are frequently omitted or misrepresented, perpetuating exclusionary narratives that impact students' perceptions of Indigenous peoples and their significance in American history. One such example is the notion of American exceptionalism through its origins of manifest destiny, a view that undermines Indigenous epistemologies and reinforces colonial domination. Tadashi concludes by offering several recommendations to history and social science guidelines, such as teaching Indigenous cultures as an epistemic system and moving beyond superficial multiculturalism, honoring Indigenous complexities with student populations and local communities, incorporating Indigenous texts and oral tradition at an equitable level, addressing historical misrepresentation and disciplinary failures in history, and using discourse analysis to expose epistemic biases in texts like the history and social science framework in which he analyzed. Caitlin Donnelly, Power, Victoria DeSimone, and Tavis D. Jules examine how CARICOM, curricular guidelines, represent Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic tradition in the Caribbean, as well as syncretic practices that blend elements from multiple faiths. While their analysis found that curricular guidelines often in the Caribbean often overlook or inadequately represent the region's rich religious heritage, which includes syncretic faiths like Rastafarianism, Voodoo, and Santeria, belief systems that reflect both African spiritual practices and colonial influence. They note that the state-run schools in St. Lucia and Jamaica have included non-Abrahamic and Caribbean indigenous traditions, while church-administered schools were less likely to do so. Rafael V. Capo Garcia provides critical examination of how Puerto Rican curricula and textbooks represent the ancient Taino teachings, while are largely considered extinct in informal practice, but remain significant to Puerto Rican heritage and identity. His analysis highlights how these representations are often minimal, superficial, or stereotype, failing to convey the full cultural and historical importance of Taino beliefs, knowledge systems, and contribution. For example, Yukahu, the primary Taino deity, appears under various names, with many textbooks portraying him through a Christian lens as a benevolent creator, despite linguistic evidence linking him to Yucca and the sea. Adabe, his mother, is often reduced to a maternal figure through scholars, though scholars argue she symbolizes water fertility and maternal lineage essential to Taino society. Hurricane-related mythology is also misrepresented. Some textbooks conflate Juban-Bansex, the storm goddess, with creation myths, while others incorrectly identify Warakan as an evil deity rather than a natural force. Capo Garcia's study underscores the need for accurate, decolonialized representations of Taino beliefs in educational materials, moving beyond Christianized and Eurocentric interpretations to reflect Indigenous worldviews and faith. Joel Morgan's chapter explores the role of storytelling in Abrahamic traditions and how the concept of restoring intertwines storytelling with restoring just relations, particularly in a decolonial context. She further critiques the colonial role of the United Church of Canada in Canada's settler colonial history and calls for a decolonial analytical approach to uncover erased Indigenous voices in historical and theological narratives. Decolonial practice is framed as a process of recognizing and resisting the coloniality of relations, which is rooted in racialized power structures, epistemological control, and the marginalization of Indigenous peoples. Morgan's analysis draws on concepts from Keanu, Mignolo, and Wolfe to demonstrate how European modernity and settler colonialism have reinforced hierarchical structures that erase Indigenous knowledge and presence. Her chapter also emphasizes the necessity for settlers to engage a critical awareness of power dynamics and complicity in colonial systems, which often involves discomfort, unlearning, and foregrounding Indigenous epistemology. According to Morgan, the process of restoring as a political and transformative act seeks to reframe narratives by cementing Indigenous voices, histories, and ways of knowing in order to disrupt and dismantle settler colonial frameworks. What students study in school helps contribute to shaping their worldviews, civic attitudes, and future interactions with people and society. Biases in education often stem from outdated narratives or perspectives that unintentionally perpetuate stereotypes or misconceptions about cultures, peoples, and belief systems, even for those that no longer exist in their historical form. What we tried to do as editors was emphasize the need to include ancient and indigenous wisdom tradition curricula with fuller and more balanced discussions, acknowledging historical violence and forced convergence. We advocate for deeper understanding of how historical narratives are constructed and the power dynamics that they reinforce. Drawing from research, we highlight the importance of engaging Indigenous scholars and elders to develop holistic educational frameworks, incorporating meditative inquiry and interdisciplinary approaches. A key issue addressed is the misrepresentation of religious conversion, particularly to Christianity and Islam, which is often depicted as solely voluntary. The editors argue for a nuanced understanding that considers syncretisms and the complex factors behind conversions. We also call for a critical examination of how dominant religious traditions have historically interpreted Indigenous traditions through their own frameworks, often leading to distortions. Ultimately, the volumes encourage inclusive education that fosters respect for Indigenous and ancient traditions, challenges misrepresentation, and promotes critical engagement with historical and contemporary religious narratives. So that's a gist of the volume on the Americas, and I'd love to take questions from people or comments or anything. Did this all make sense to people?
And so people can feel free to come off mute to ask questions. You can also drop them into the chat if you prefer.
I have more just a comment, and it goes back to when you were talking about how children would be taken and put into the mission schools and, being westernized. And in talking with my daughter who works with uh, the indigenous people in Alaska, that's still a strong carryover emotional feeling and a dislike, um, still present, that it still carries over into today's society. And I said that just kind of struck me that it's still hanging on.
Remember, it didn't happen that long ago, so that's why it's still there. So
Yeah.
it's still within, and more and more been made aware of it too. Right now, they become more aware of what happened at the time while it was happening. I mean, it was even here in the United States, they were being sent to boarding schools in the East Coast, right? And they were native groups that were out west, right? Their children from, like, let's say South Dakota or Dakota territories at that time were being sent to boarding schools in Massachusetts. There were Anglo-American women, right, that were that were against this, right? And what they did was they started schools on the Indian territories. The curricula was still sort of a way to sort of assimilate them. And the way they reconciled that was by saying that if they didn't, they would be killed off, right? So there was still that curriculum that was trying to sort of make him Anglo-Americans, I guess. So that was like the big first step when you had sort of these mission teachers moving out west. Not only did they open up schools for these new communities out west, but they were also opening up schools on these reservations to keep these kids from being taken from their homes and be sent out east to be assimilated. So, what Canada has done, from what I've seen and what I've learned from this process, was there is this sort of reconciliation. So, if you remember, even the former Pope Francis, he's apologized to the Indigenous groups in Canada for these boarding schools, which was a huge step, right, for the Catholic Church to sort of acknowledge a wrong, right? I mean, it took him almost like 500 years to acknowledge the geocentric theory versus the heliocentric theory. So that was like a tremendous step for these groups. Um, Canada has sort of been more open to it than, let's say, here in the United States. We've been less open to this idea. So we'll see what happens, right? Um, there is a sort of animosity, right? Um, what happened in America's past, what happened to the indigenous groups in the United States, right? With, territory and land, a lot of them killed off because of disease brought upon by the Europeans, but also, because of these um, because of war and that was going on between the U.S. government and the indigenous groups. Um, and when I look at it, it's almost like a different way. How Europeans think and how the indigenous people think is completely different, right? Just one example is the idea of like having them sign to give up their land. That would be like asking somebody today to give up like air or oxygen, right? It belongs to everybody. It doesn't just can't belong. They couldn't have imagined that somebody could like put barbed wire around this land and sit there with a gun and protect it that way, right? The land belongs, it's part of nature, it belongs to everybody. Um, so signing this contract to give up the land, they really didn't understand what they were signing, right, from their perspective. Other questions or comments? And Melody, you said you were doing some stuff, mission work or something? Sorry, I was getting a phone
Yeah,
call.
I just finished a 2-year project. By career-wise, I'm a certified diabetes education and care specialist, and I've done that for over 25 years. And I responded to an article in the Covenant Companion that was put out by the Paul Carlson Partnership that they were looking for people healthcare professionals to be part of a medical ambassador resource team to help write diabetes and hypertension educational materials for patients and staff in our clinics and hospitals in the Congo. And so I've worked for 2 years with a team to do this, and we completed the project. So it's been in its beta phases and being piloted now in Karawa. And that was really an interesting thing because a learning on both parts, because we wanted to make it culturally appropriate, which we did to the best of our knowledge. And we sent a couple members of our team over to actually eat the food and see how they do things differently and how do we adapt it and how do we work with the minimal resources that were available. It was also a learning experience because on the team I was the only specialist. So it was also educating our Western partners in that, this glucose machine isn't going to work if you don't, when you have malnutrition clinics and your anemia, if you have too low of a red blood cell count, the machines don't work appropriately. So it was education on both components. And it was a great opportunity and a great learning experience. And it's like, okay, we have to come up with how much is a serving of protein and what is their protein? And their protein are caterpillars. So how many caterpillars make up a serving of protein? When we were doing the signs and symptoms of high blood sugar, normally in the United States, we'll have a picture of a bathroom or a toilet stall. Well, they use the bushes. So we had to adapt the literature to that. We had to consider that when you're doing portion control, we think of, okay, we have a plate method in the United States that so much is this and so much is this and so much is this. They use a communal bowl. And
Yeah.
part of that is because of limited water resources. So it was trying to consider all those neat
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. It's interesting how the geography shapes how much it shapes a culture. Like
Yeah.
when I used to teach high school history, it was, the Maya didn't have a wheel, right? And then kids would be like, oh, how can they not figure out the wheel? It's the Babylonians had figured it out. But I mean, if you're in a jungle, how are you going to use a wheel? You know what I mean? It's impossible, right? It's muddy, there's jungle, so it's easier to sort of put stuff on your back and carry it through or put it on an animal to get it, to the other side, right? So it doesn't make any sense to use it. Or there was another missionary, he's now an anthropologist. He went in the Amazon rainforest and he discovered something that was thought to be universal, that everybody had numbers, but they didn't have numbers. They only had few or many. And the way he tested it was he put like, I don't know, like 3 spoons down, and he said to them, "Well, how many are here?" And they said few. They said few. And then he put like 10 down, and he said, "How many are here?" And they said many. And he tested it that way. So it's like a different sort of way of thinking, but their thinking is shaped
Mhm.
by the
Yeah.
environment in which they live. So it's pretty fascinating. And I know, Roshana, you were doing some work at Harvard, right? With um, some of those African traditions, right? I don't know if Roshana's still there,
Oh, I am. Hey,
but
folks.
it got me thinking about the Gullah people in South Carolina, off the island of South Carolina, that even after the emancipation of the slaves in the 1864, you had mission groups and you had teachers that would go down to um, South to educate the African American population. But one such teacher her name was Forden, from what I remember, and she was African American from Boston, and she came from a well-to-do African American family, but she felt it was her calling to go educate the children that were recently freed. And she ended up going to the Gullah. And one of the things that she noticed was that they still spoke a West African language, and they still had a lot of these sort of indigenous traditions. And that was the one thing that really caught her eye. And like I said, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, from a historical point of view, I know, Roshana, you do history too, but to say like 200 years was a long time ago, that's not a long time ago within the context of general history, right? I like to tell this to my students today. I say to them, well, how many people have walked this earth? How many people have been on this planet? Humans walked this planet in number. A lot of people don't know that. 100 billion people have walked this earth. To me, that is fascinating. There've been 100 billion people who've lived on this planet that have come and gone. Each of those people had their own stories, and we barely know all their stories or any of their stories. To me, that's a fascinating statistic. 100 billion souls have come and gone on this planet. It's pretty amazing when there's 7 billion people or 8 billion people maybe now on this planet. So just to sort of wrap that around your head, like what their lives were like, what contributions they made to this world is kind of that in itself is interesting.
There is expression in psychology that culture comes before science, and then like for example, David Grant, who developed brain spotting, so he said like majority of science have been created by Westerns, yes,
Yeah,
like all of that measure, assessment tools, and other things. And what's the amount of the Westerns? It's 1 billion, yeah? Or how many, like, yeah, 1 billion. What about the other 8 billion? Or 7 billion, how you're saying?
right.
Yeah. So culture comes first. So even like for me, I have lived in Chicago for 11 years, and for me it was hard to be like, apart from my own Kazakh culture. And I just arrived, like literally, like this is my second week, and like adapting again. And then I'm still seeing how my people, they have been using that ancient some traditions, like making, for example, like seven like oily breads and spreading to the neighbors. Like it's so fascinating how that ancient culture is still like slightly still there. So
It,
yeah, culture comes first, before
yeah, yeah,
science, I mean.
yeah. I mean, I remember my grandmother when her brother died. She would sing dirges. Does everyone know what dirges are? They're funerary songs, right? And the reason they
Uh-huh.
do dirges is because when somebody dies, because it's so the soul it's so traumatic for the soul, right? Once somebody dies, that they sing songs to help them to the afterlife, right? And this is like a long-standing tradition. And there was a stele, which is like a tombstone, found in Western Turkey, and it's
Mm-hmm.
2,000 years old. And the stele is
Mm-hmm.
a song of somebody's wife who died 2,000 years ago. And I can't remember the word. May you go. I can't remember the word, but it's a beautiful sort of song, right? And it's actually a dirge. So it's a long-standing tradition that had been going on unbroken for 2,000 years from paganism, and then it became
Mm-hmm.
intertwined with Christianity, right? To me, that's fascinating, right? To continue that sort of tradition for 2000. Obviously, it's not the same song, but it's sort of the melody is the same, right? It's almost like sort of high pitched sort of singing. Um,
Yeah, that's definitely interesting, which just makes sense. Song is just like every culture has some sort of the songs, or like a type of the
it,
songs, or
it's
pitch of
it's
the songs.
it's
And
it
then with
becomes
the grieving.
Yeah, and it's
Uh-huh.
because it's so emotional, it's hard to give that up. You know what I
Yes.
mean? You're not going to give that up so easy. And that's how anthropologists sort of come up with like seeing if somebody's from the same culture. They look at like how their towns were built, what their art looked like, but also how they buried their dead,
Mhm.
right? Which is such a sort of personal sort of thing, emotional thing, right? How you bury people, right? And you could see even after the
Mhm.
advent of Christianity in Europe, the way people are buried, it's almost still in that sort of pre-Christian sort of tradition with like, figures in the tomb, right? Coins to help them pay the person to get to the other side.
And it's interesting how you're commenting how we combine some of the cultural things with our Christianity, because my daughter has been seeing that in Alaska, because they do the dirges for a whole week in the smaller villages, etc. And they, in her particular case, they do in the villages, the village does the funeral. There are no funeral directors. The family cleans the body, they make the coffin, and she was actually asked to help make the coffin one time for one of the people she knew.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right.
And
Or
that was actually an honor for her to be asked to do that
yeah, I mean,
as a Caucasian person.
yeah. I mean, here I live in Evanston now, and once in a while I'll see like this ambulance go by, and it's in Hebrew. Skokie is next door. It has a large Jewish community, but there though there's a sort of Jewish ambulance service because if somebody is killed in an accident, the rabbi needs to be there immediately. Roshana, I see your hand up.
Oh, yeah, you all, I'm learning so much. I feel like I want to ping pong off of what all of you are saying. I so my research team, we just conducted this special history study of the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow House and George Washington's headquarters in Cambridge over on Tory Row. And so, like I mentioned, we've been working with about 40 of the living descendants of the people enslaved at the site. And so we've been my team of five. Oh, by the way, this is through the National Park Service and the National Council on Public History. Not that I'm plugging, this is not a commercial, but I want to give them credit. But we've been uh, actively engaged with archives in like five different countries, and it's just been the most robust research project that delves into like 4 centuries of history. And so one of the things that I was just blown away by, because the transatlantic slave trade, sent shockwaves around the world, affected about 14 million people and their living descendants. And so being able to engage with multiple generations of a family that have inherited really fraught um, this this fraught family story, and by extension cultural inheritance, like the proceeds from their ancestors being enslaved at this site created Harvard Law School, and its wealth. Professor Simon Greenleaf over at the law school wrote the Liberian Constitution. So the aftershocks of what happened to this family literally wound its way around the world. And so in this research study, we're like finding naming conventions, enslaved people that had been brought to the United States still had Ghanaian names. So even after their ancestors and some of them had been trafficked, they were still naming their children and grandchildren in accordance with what they brought over with them. And when it comes to the burial traditions, a few of my teammates were able to travel with some of the descendants to Jamaica and Antigua, where they learned more about the built environment and how their ancestors and fellow enslaved folks buried the dead. And then we were able to rematriate and repatriate some of the remains to Ghana. And it was such a lesson about reverence and solemnity. And it was radical I'm Black, to also be a descendant of enslaved people. And it turns out that the vassal family that enslaved these people, a branch of them married into Thomas Jefferson's family and enslaved people in Florida, and those were my ancestors. And so here I am, this
That through his
African. Oh,
through Hemmings,
I'm sorry.
Is that through his second wife, Sally
Oh,
Hemings?
oh, so this is through a descendant, Anna Vassal,
Okay. Okay.
whose descendants marry Thomas Jefferson's grandson, T.J. Epps, in Florida.
But this
Um,
wasn't the kids that he had with Sally Hemings.
oh no,
No. Okay.
no, a different branch. But
Okay.
it was fascinating to be African American, to be a practitioner, but then to find out that we can prevent the slave trade from getting the last word. And so even after all of that catastrophe, we're bringing remains home and we're through ceremony honoring human dignity and community and family. And I'll stop there. But I appreciate what you all are sharing so
No,
much.
that's amazing. No, that's great. That's amazing. Right? That's a wonderful story. And you see more and more of that sort of connection now that you see there with the a lot of African Americans are now visiting the west coast of Africa in Ghana and Liberia. And they're in Liberia, especially, there's a lot of African Americans who, after are emancipated, go settle into Liberia, right? And establish a government over there. And that's why the Liberian flag ends up looking a lot like the American flag.
Yeah, I think it was a few years ago that Chris Tucker did a documentary with Dr. Henry Louis Gates about going back to the west coast of Africa because he does that Finding Your Roots show,
Yeah.
and they talked about the pathways of this transatlantic slave trade and things like that. It was really interesting. Well, this was a robust conversation. I personally have learned a ton
And
here.
what Shauna said about the blues, that's interesting you bring that up, the blues, because there is a book that I read that the person who wrote the book on the dirges, he does compare it to the blues in African American culture, which is interesting how you picked that up, Roshana.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Zervas,
Yeah, and
for
then
joining
Roshana's
us.
got a link to her project here. I'm gonna
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely
I'd
check
love to see
out.
it because it sounds awesome work.
Yeah, check that out. Thank you for sharing, Rayshana. So thank you, Dr. Zervas, for joining us today. We have one more Compass Talk for this year coming up Wednesday, December 17th.